Welcome to the Ask the Geographer podcast series, brought to you by the Education Department at the Royal Geographical Society with IBG. I'm Rachel, your host, and in each episode I'll be joined by geographers from across the globe to delve into current events, publications and research, all tied to the fascinating world of geography. In this episode of Ask the Geographer podcast, we are delving into the realms of disaster risk and hazard management. Hazards and disaster risk have always been an integral element of geography. We have an immense fascination with the processes that lead to specific hazards, their impact on people and the environment, as well as how we can manage them for the future. Developing methods to protect people is essential in ensuring we can mitigate hazards, particularly within vulnerable communities. I'm delighted to introduce our guest, Dr Martin Parham, Lecturer in Disaster Management at the HCRI at the University of Manchester. Martin brings extensive expertise in hazards, with a particular passion for improving disaster risk education in multi-hazard areas, especially within small island states. Martin, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So could you tell us a little bit about your current projects?
Yeah, sure. So, it's probably first kind of worth pointing out that I haven't done this my whole life. I actually used to be a teacher, and I spent 20 years working in secondary schools. So a lot of my kind of interests and my research links very much to my kind of career as a teacher. So I understand kind of where students are coming from. But yeah, my current projects, I've got a few actually, and I'll just briefly tell you about a few of them. So the one linked to education that I've got going on at the moment, I'm really interested in engaging students in disaster management and all over the world, not just in the UK. And so one of the things that I've done is I've been setting up simulations. And what I do is I create these simulations, these whole day events that actually bring in school students from, we've done it in the UK, we're going to set it up in the Caribbean. I've done it in the Caribbean as well, which is mostly where I do my study. And they come in and they take part in a whole day's worth of kind of practical, participatory events. And they kind of get involved in what it must be like to communicate a hazard that's arriving, or to be part of the decision-making activity of a hazard that is about to happen, or, for example, how to give aid, and to kind of simulate those things. And we kind of do it in the context of like group discussion. We do it in the context of using technology to design things. We actually use like drama as well to kind of recreate these situations. And the whole idea is it gives these students an idea of what it must be like to be in that situation as a decision maker or as a person who's actually in a hazard. And I kind of personally feel it's a little bit better than the good old fashioned kind of like fire drill that you get at school, which is kind of what I experienced when I was at school. Because let's be honest, in schools, we don't really do a lot of hazard simulation. So that's one of my projects. And I've actually just come back from Barbados, and I was talking about the concept of hazards in Barbados recently. And I've been setting this project up with about 15 schools in Barbados and the disaster emergency management people there, the Red Cross, the UN or UNICEF. And we were talking about the prospect of hurricanes actually, and the impact of hurricanes on Barbados. And just unbelievably this week, just after I've left, a big Category 4 hurricane has kind of come straight past the front door of Barbados, Hurricane Beryl. And it's also, luckily, it didn't have a great impact on Barbados, but unfortunately, it then went on to St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the Caribbean and had quite a severe impact. And so it's quite pertinent, really. It's quite important that we actually kind of consider these potential things and that we actually practice how these events might happen. So that's one of my projects that I do, Rachel. Another one that I've been doing is looking at how people understand hazards. And I've worked in a country called Dominica, again, in the Caribbean. And in Dominica, I look at how communities understand hazards and how that varies from what the experts say. So imagine that you live in a place and that all you've ever seen is a flood, okay? And that you think, I know how to deal with a flood, but you haven't perhaps considered the potential for a landslide, or you haven't considered that perhaps where you live also could be subject to a tsunami. So what we do is we get the experts into specific locations, and when I say the experts, I mean, it's good to draw experience from a whole range of different people rather than just me go in there and make things up. And we kind of like understand what the actual hazards are in that particular space and what's the likelihood of those hazards happening in that space. And then we go and talk to the people that live there, and we ask them questions, and we ask them about their experiences and what they've kind of dealt with in their time. And then what we do is we kind of link that together to try and understand the difference between the actual versus the kind of potential or likely hazards and what the people think. Okay, and that's really important, because if you live in a space and people only consider one thing, but they haven't considered something else, then what that says is that the people that are responsible for managing hazards need to really kind of emphasize that hazard that hasn't been considered. One of the things that I do, which I'm really interested in, is mapping and GIS. And I'm actually turning that idea into a map, whereby you map the actual hazard versus you map the perception of the hazard, and then you look for the differences. And so the areas with the greatest differences in a particular town or village are the areas that we need to consider the most. So that's two of my projects, Rachel. I can talk to you about more if you want.
Oh, those two sound incredibly interesting, and it's fascinating to hear the fact that it seems to be very human focused and being able to have them understand the hazard. I think that's one of the greatest ways of being able to get humans engaged, isn't it, with that hazard, is actually getting them to know how it feels and what it's like.
You're right. And actually, we talk about hazards, and a lot of people are interested in hazards because it's going to sound awful, because of the excitement almost of the events that happen, and they are physical events, and these physical events happen all the time. But the fact is a hazard because of the fact that it can have an impact on people. And the problem in academic world is that there's too often the case that people either study the physical environment or they study the people. And so I'm one of these very unusual people that kind of bridge the gap between both. And so my background is actually physical geography and geology and earth science. But my career as a teacher and my career kind of like being able to communicate with people has meant that I've pulled those two ideas together. And believe it or not, that is still a relatively new area of the academic world, to bring those two together. People are still focused on one or the other, which is why it's really, really difficult sometimes, and why we have problems in terms of like managing hazards, because often people that have a good scientific background and have like a technical kind of, I don't know, physics or chemistry background, and you ask them to explain to a young child, right, what's the likelihood of this volcano erupting and what type of materials? The problem is they often use language that goes above that individual. And so I've kind of carved out a little niche in my own little world of understanding how young people particularly and communities understand, and how we can better communicate the physical hazard that I just also happen to understand.
So you mentioned that you were a teacher, so it's clear that you've had passion coming up through the education side of things. But what really did spark your interest in hazard management?
It's a good question. It's going to sound really kind of cliched and cheesy, but I'm one of these people that I like being outdoors, and I kind of watch people live life in the world. And the way I see people is that they think they can control everything. Okay, but all I would say to you is that if you ever climb a mountain, or you go walking out in the middle of nowhere in a glacial environment or a desert, and you kind of stand there and you realize that there's a point at which that you as an individual, you are not superior to the environment. Okay, and so I was fascinated by that, and the particular element that took me into hazard management, it goes back to perhaps I trained to be a teacher, and I'm one of these people that I can never stop doing things. So I always wanted to be a teacher. It was that or a farmer. Okay, don't ask me why. And then I decided that once I was a teacher, I still wanted to continue to study. And so I watched a program in the 1990s called Horizon, which was on the BBC, and it was a program about supervolcanoes. And it was a program made fundamentally by a bunch of lecturers and professors in UCL in London, okay, which was back then the Benfield Hazard Research Centre. And they did a project, well, they were talking about the volcano Yellowstone. and they were talking about how Yellowstone, and they'd found evidence of ash over millions of years that kind of existed on the other side of the USA, and it was meters deep. Okay, and I was thinking, wow, what caused that? That's really kind of what sparked my interest. And they went on to talk about how this particular volcano, Yellowstone, had erupted 3 times, and that its eruptions were so big that actually humans would have creaked at the seams. It would have been an extinction level event. And so that kind of made me interested in the concept of extinction level events. And so I started looking into that, and events that perhaps have caused the end. And everyone knows about the meteorite that kind of hits the Earth. But perhaps what people don't realize is that actually the meteorite that hits the Earth and killed off all the dinosaurs, well, the reason it did that is because it fractured the surface, the eggshell almost of the surface of the Earth, releasing large amounts of magma. And that large amounts of magma released large amounts of gas. And that large amounts of gas is what actually changed the atmosphere in such a way that caused the death of the dinosaurs, not just in the location around where the meteor hit in Mexico, in the Yucatan Peninsula, but all over the Earth. And so I was thinking, wow, this is an event, or these events could actually change the fabric of the Earth. And I was thinking, well, as people, are we ready for this? And so it really got me interested in, well, what are we ready for? How do we manage these hazards? And, looking at particularly these low magnitude, those low frequency, high magnitude events that we've got on Earth. And that was my kind of route in. And then after that, it's kind of taken me on. And that's why I'm also really interested in climate change, because climate change to me is like the silent bully. It's like one of these things that will come up and tap you on the shoulder, and you won't see it coming, but it will already be too late by the time it gets to you. Okay. And so for me, these kind of hazards that are part of our society that exist in plain sight that we just don't see. Okay, and so that's really what gets me about hazard management. The more I've got into it, the more I've realised that governments and businesses, they kind of exist in this kind of world, this kind of closed little world. And we've seen this with COVID. The minute something happens that kind of disrupts that kind of world, is the point at which everyone's like, oh my goodness, like we need to do something about this. And so really I'm fascinated by how we manage these events, and how we manage these events that we're just simply not accustomed to. And do we learn ultimately? That's really it.
That is the ultimate question, really, isn't it? Do we actually learn from these?
Yeah.
So I can see that you've got a specific focus on small island developing states. So what drew you specifically to this area?
Yeah, again, it's fascinating, really. I guess the thing about studying and the thing about your interests is that you're very much guided by the people that you meet on your route. And I would advise anyone. People always say to me, oh, you must be really clever. You've done a PhD. I would say it's a bit like running a marathon. You start off by training for a 5K, and then you do a 10K. And before you know it, you're doing a half marathon. And then stupidly, you go, yeah, I'll sign up for the marathon. That's a great idea, right? Okay. And I guess studying was like that. My supervisors, when I did I was working full time as a teacher. And I decided to study as well while working full-time as a teacher, which is a bit insane. I'm not going to lie. But I did my master's research, and during my master's research, I studied at London University Birkbeck, and I'll give them a little plug. And I met a guy called Dr Simon Day. And Dr Simon Day is somebody who specialises in tsunamis. And he's kind of come up with this theory that one of the Canary Islands, La Palma, would collapse into the sea and cause this huge tsunami. And I was like, oh, okay. I read about his work, and then he became my supervisor. So he was very much the reason I was guided towards these islands. And what he really made me realise is that these islands are like sandcastles. So if you ever go to the beach and you're sitting on the beach and you're kind of making a little sandcastle, and then the tide comes in, okay, and as the sea comes in, and it starts to kind of eat away and crash onto that kind of like sandcastle that you've made. And before you know it, it starts to collapse. And then over time, it's gone. That is exactly how small islands basically develop, volcanic islands. Now, why study these small island developing states? Well, they're pretty much on their own. Okay, these are little kind of isolated areas. They might be linked to another country, but they often manage themselves. Okay, so it's a closed community. Okay, it's very much like, right, well, if you think about London as a place, or Manchester or Birmingham, they're quite huge areas, and there's quite transient communities whereby people are coming and going. Often on these islands, the islands are very much kind of like isolated. They might be tourist destinations, but the people that live there have grown up there and have got experience there. And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to try and kind of understand how these people think? These people are often on the front line of these hazards. And so that's fundamentally the reason. There's kind of political reasons, there's the geographical reasons there. Okay, but fundamentally, as a study site, it's also quite a nice controlled area in which to study. I would say at this point, if you ever haven't visited some of these islands, they're often volcanoes as well. And some of the ones that I visited, I mentioned the Canary Islands, the island of La Palma in the Canary Islands, it erupted in 2021. It was quite crazy to see that I'd studied that same area myself when I did my master's in 2015. And I was like, oh, wow, that's the place that I studied and it's now erupting. And the other place that I would strongly recommend, other than Iceland, everyone knows about Iceland, right? Okay, on the middle of the mid-Atlantic ridge, as the ridge is tearing apart and you've got this island which has grown up out from kind of Atlantic seafloor. Okay, and that's a fascinating place. And that's also erupted. Well, it's kind of still simmering away on the kind of peninsula. The one I'd really recommend that you visit, though, is the Aeolian Islands. They're off the coast of Sicily, and there's a volcano there called Stromboli. And Stromboli is the lighthouse of the Mediterranean, and it erupts every 20 minutes on average. And if you ever want to feel kind of small in the world, go to Stromboli. Okay, because Stromboli is a wonderful place to kind of see the true force of nature right in front of you. So yeah, these are wonderful places to visit. They're wonderful people. They're wonderful communities. And as I say, they're quite nice controlled areas.
Yeah, once again, kind of going back to the kind of people-centric point of view that seems to be majorly part of your studying of looking at people and how they react to these disasters.
And I just realised, actually, there's one other thing that really did inspire me about these islands. One of the areas of the world that has many volcanoes is Indonesia, and that part of the world. And there's an island in that part of the world called Rabaul. And Rabaul had a volcano in it, and it's got a really great story. In the 1980s, Rabaul, this big, really quite potentially dangerous volcano, people live in the crater. And the crater represents like the kind of a bay, in essence, near the coast. And people live there. And in the 1980s, you had increased seismic activity. And that means that normally that means with a volcano that the magma's rising. Okay, that's what it means. So for people that are living in the crater, that's obviously a scary sign. So all the scientists from around the world went there and they educated the people. And classically, nothing happened. Classically, nothing happened. But in 1994, about 10 years later, the scientists, they'd set up an observatory in the 10 years in between, the scientists did, and signs started happening again. Seismic activity started happening again. And the scientists were like, oh, okay, it's low level. But the people who live by the coast in the crater, they remembered the lessons that they'd learned. And they started taking action themselves. And 17,000 people evacuated themselves. And although the scientists said that this was a low-level activity, in true fashion, like many volcanoes, it then erupted. Okay, and in actual fact, the fact that the people would remove themselves meant that the death count was like in single figures. Okay, it was really low, and so the kind of how people are in tune with their environment in these locations. I've often found that people on islands are particularly in tune with like agriculture, with the animals, with the actual landscape, in a way that perhaps people that live on like the main continental mass aren't. And so again, it's a wonderful kind of experience learning from these people about what they know. And I think that's really important to understand that, particularly for students, we don't go to places and tell them what to do. We go to places to learn from them. Okay, and we learn from them, and we kind of it's like your teachers at school, right? They're trying to direct you in the right way. We're just trying to direct people, and we're trying to use their experience and their knowledge to better kind of improve their understanding based on what they already know.
Fantastic. So, in your view, what do you feel has been the main breakthroughs in disaster risk education in recent years?
Wow, that's a good question, because disaster risk education, people are like, what's that? And I hate to say it, but it's still a case of what's that? A lot of people don't study it. And there's a simple reason why a lot of people don't study it, because to be in disaster risk education, really, you probably needed to be a teacher. Okay, or you probably needed to have some experience. But how many teachers make the jump to the academic world? And I hate to say it also, but you might go, oh yeah, but these NGOs or these charities, they produce lots of resources. Often they're produced by people that have no educational or limited educational background. And that is no disrespect to these people, but there is a difference between having worked in the classroom and not. So the key kind of breakthroughs, I feel, for disaster risk education, and it's a bit more kind of policy orientated. In 2005, there was a summit, and it was in Japan. And I don't mean a mountain, I mean a meeting. Um, and in this meeting, it was called the Hyogo Framework. And it happened because of the Asian tsunami, which obviously happened in Boxing Day in 2004. And part of that, they included in that disaster risk education, because everyone remembers the story of the young girl on the beach who was there and actually looked out into sea and said, oh yeah, I remember learning about that in geography. And the tsunami rolls in, and she was kind of, they said, oh, you saved hundreds of people that day, because she encouraged people to move to higher ground. And so that kind of story led to, in 2005, policy going in, which said that you need to actually account for disaster risk education. It was the first time it was ever done, like internationally. Unfortunately, 10 years later, another framework came out, which was called the Sendai Framework, again in Japan. And this time they excluded education from it. Now, the reason might be because they found it so difficult to put in place. But the good news is that since then, there's been something called the Comprehensive School Safety Framework. And what that does is it encourages, it doesn't mandate, it encourages schools or countries to do three things. Number one, to put disaster risk reduction or hazard management in the curriculum. Number two, to make the school building safer. Okay, so actually, in many countries, school buildings are shelters. Okay, in a case of a hurricane or a flood, people can go there, so that they need to be safe buildings. And number three, to actually think about that local space where the school is, and actually devise evacuation routes from the school. Okay, so that in case the school was affected, because if you think about community, school is a community in itself. So it's really important to do it. So while there's been lots of technological kind of advancements in education, for me, the fact that disaster risk education is encouraged in and around the world is a great thing. It still makes me kind of think in the UK though, like I remember teaching and I remember thinking, well, where's disaster risk education in our education system? Our education system in the UK is quite old fashioned. We're still doing the same subjects we did 30, 40, 50 years ago. Okay. And even the kind of main exam boards, they haven't massively updated. It's still kind of the same stuff that we were doing 6 to 10 years ago. So there's definitely opportunity all the time for it to improve, but it's a start.
Definitely. You've kind of touched on the kind of challenges areas here, and there's so much more to add into the curriculum. But what do you feel personally is the biggest challenge there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really fascinating thing, and I don't. This is going to sound wrong. I don't want to make it sound bad in any way, but one of the most difficult things in some places is implementing disaster risk education into the curriculum, and the reason being is because let's think about our own leaders, our own head teachers. What are their backgrounds? How many of them have a background in geography? You know, I know Prime Minister Theresa May, when she was a geographer, but how many other prime ministers are geographers? The point I'm trying to make is that how important is it in the minds of the decision makers that we do these things? So there's that challenge there at the top level, which is getting decision makers and people that are responsible to have that kind of awareness of geography. Okay, understand the importance of it, particularly with climate change. But the second challenge really is the actual teachers themselves. So many teachers are teaching curriculum and they have very good understanding in their curriculum, but they're given so little flexibility beyond the curriculum to actually explore new things. And our teachers out there are a wonderful resource. Okay, and so we should use them more. But if you go to countries like in the Caribbean region, often teachers don't have a qualification. And so they may be students that have left college that are coming back into the classroom. And so it's important for people that have an understanding and have a kind of ability to communicate, to work with these people, to actually help them. But the difficulty is that, like I say, it's not a well-studied area. And so the challenge really kind of comes back down to that individual who's working in that school. And often in places that are doing it really well, it's to do with one person that's got a real passion. That's often the case. And that passion doesn't have to come out of teaching. It could come out of voluntary work, or it can come out of their position within the community, okay, and actually them being a leader. And often what you need to do is encourage young people to kind of take on responsibility for themselves rather than actually be told what to do. I often find it frustrating in schools how schools just tell students what to do. But actually, the minute you give students the sense of kind of responsibility, they can do some wonderful things, which is why I personally am interested in doing simulation with students and putting them in the role of decision making and making leaders out of them. Because to me, that's so important. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges. And then if you imagine every school in every place is a different environment with different hazards, the challenges are huge. And so there's plenty of work to be done in this space. If anyone's interested, please come along.
Fantastic. You've mentioned the Caribbean quite a lot within our conversations, and from looking at your bio, your PhD focused on multi-hazard risk in the Caribbean. This is a region that's complex geologically. It's got developmental complexities and social dynamics. It's quite hard to narrow down which one you want to choose from this one, but which do you think has the most influence on disaster risk framework?
Wow, that's a good question. I mean, as a physical geographer and as a kind of earth scientist, I'm going to always say to you, we need to understand the physical environment. Too often, we don't understand the physical environment. And so I'll give you an example of what I mean. I go to Dominica and I speak to the local people and I say, we talk about the volcano. And they're like, oh, what do you mean? The bit at the top of the hill? And I'm like, no, I mean the hill itself. The entire northern part of your island is the volcano. And they're like, oh, okay. Are you sure you don't mean the bit at the top of the hill, right? And so it's a challenge in terms of what people understand. And obviously, people's experiences dictate what they understand. So the physical environment is complex. And like we've already said, there's what we can see and what we experience, and then there's what we don't see, okay, and what hasn't happened. But I hate to say this. For me, the key kind of like driver really in this region is politics. Okay, it's politics. How things are run, and it's not just in the Caribbean, it's everywhere. How things are run, if you think about how politics works, it works within cycles, 4 or 5 year cycles. And in 4 or 5 year cycles, what's the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is to get back into power. And power is what really drives decision making, okay, in the world. And so one of the things that we actually look at on our course in Manchester, our course is International Disaster Risk Management, put that in there, is we look at the relationship between the physical environment and the kind of social dynamic and the political dynamic. And that is really important because if you've got a politician and you've got a leader that's really involved in monitoring and kind of managing that public, like the leader is currently in Barbados. She has a fantastic oversight of climate change, and she's doing everything she can in her country to kind of manage that. If you look at New Zealand, during COVID, Jacinda Ardern, she was a great leader as well, and she actually was quite forward thinking in terms of like how we managed or how they managed COVID and what was the best thing. The problem with leadership is that, and I often teach my students this, you're making difficult decisions with imperfect information, and you will be judged by that. Okay, and that's why I like doing simulations with students, to give them that experience of that pressure, okay, that decision-making pressure with the available information that they have. So more often than not, in a situation where you've got a small island state like the Caribbean, they have to focus on their economic development and their social welfare. That's what's important to them day by day by day. But ultimately, you need politics to be mindful of the wider situation. But let's be honest, in the world is not as simple as just one island. There's interconnections, as we know, through globalization between different states. And so the Caribbean region is heavily influenced by, for example, the USA. It's also got heavy colonial influence with France and the Netherlands, and obviously the UK as well. And so there's those kind of political relationships that also exist. And so it's a really complex situation. And so I don't really have an answer for you there, which is the most important thing. Politics is really important, but economically, day to day, social welfare of people is important on a day to day basis. And on top of that, you've got these hazards that occur relatively infrequently. And I always say to my students, imagine you've got a pot of money to spend. Okay, imagine you're in charge and you've got a pot of money to spend. And I'm going to give you some likely percentages of things happening. So likely percentage number one is that there's high level unemployment. And let's say that's in the 60 or 70%. And we need to address that. Percentage number two, we've got a hurricane, like a big hurricane that might happen, and there's a 1 or 2% chance. Like if you're faced with that kind of situation, what are you going to spend your pot of money on? You know, percentage game says you're going to spend it on the things that matter to your people there and then. And if it happens to get you back in power, happy days.
Yeah, definitely. So again, bringing it back to the people there, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, that said, I will say that in terms of the Caribbean, they do a wonderful job with a really finite amount of resources. Okay. And to give you an example of what I'm talking about, in Barbados, hazards are managed by the Disaster Emergency Management Centre. And that's kind of linked to the government. Working in that building is probably about 15 people. Okay. And that's responsible for the entire island. And they're doing a whole range of different things, from actually going out into the field and understanding. If you've got a population of tens to hundreds of thousands, is 15 people enough? In Dominica, in the Caribbean, the Office of Disaster Management is staffed by about 6 to 8 people. Most of them have no physical understanding of geophysical hazards like earthquakes and volcanoes. They're mostly background in hurricanes because that's what affects them most. So even if you have that understanding, you still have a bias perhaps towards what it is that you understand. And so again, there's a great challenge for these people. They're doing a fantastic job with limited resources in political climates that are often changing.
Wonderful. So I've noticed you've also got an interest in volcanic risk on basaltic ocean island volcanoes. It's quite a long way to say it. So what intrigues you about this topic?
Yeah, I guess, right, okay, let's put it this way, right? So there's two types of volcanoes in my mind. Volcanoes are like children. You imagine you've got like the calm passive one that sits in the corner and takes everything and it's all good, always calm. And then you've got the quite excitable one that likes to get really involved. To me, volcanoes are like that, and there's a whole range of them in between as well. So if you've got a volcano that exists on a plate boundary where one plate is going under another, we call it subduction. That's gonna give you the more kind of explosive, excitable kind of situation. The other circumstance is where you've got magma rising through and the crust is pulling apart or the crust is thin. And so we often get that where the oceans are spreading, or where you get little islands. And so we call these basaltic ocean island volcanoes, and they're often quite effusive. So to give you an example, like I've mentioned them already, Iceland is a good example, the Canary Islands are good examples, the Cape Verdes are good examples. Hawaiian Islands, did I mention that? Yeah, that's all of the Pacific island. Any island basically in the ocean is one of these. Okay, it's one of these. And so I like these ones because they're calm. You can go and stand next to them while they're erupting. You can actually experience them. From a kind of experience point of view, they are quite dangerous. The temperature of the magma coming out of these can exceed over 1,000 degrees. And if you're standing in a place and the wind changes direction, you're going to get basically pretty hot pretty quick. Okay, but the reality is that they work in kind of cycles. So they often build up from the seafloor. They often then build up, if they're lucky, above the ocean. And then they get eroded down again by the sea. And that erosion brings the magma source closer to the surface again. So then they erupt again and build again. And then eventually, over time, they disappear. And so if we look at Hawaiian Islands, and this is the other thing that really fascinated me, is that the life cycle of these islands is about kind of 5 to 10 million years, which I know in our lifetime is like massive, but in a kind of geological sense is short. But Hawaii if you look at where Hawaii is now, if we go forward 10 million years, Hawaii won't exist. It will be under the sea. But what fascinates me most is that the Canary Islands are 15 million years old. And the question is, why are they still there? Okay, and that's what's really interesting. So Lanzarote, if you go to Lanzarote, like a big banana-shaped island in the Canaries, it's 15 million years old. It's 3 times as old as Hawaii. Like geologically, it shouldn't be there. Okay, but the reason it's still there is because the progress of like the movement of the crust has been slowed down, and so it's been slowed down by Africa. Okay, and so it's actually been able to stay in the same position without being moved and eroded, and that's kind of prolonged its life. And it even erupted a couple of hundred years ago, which is madness. Okay, we don't expect that from these type of volcanoes. So I like these. They're simple. They're safe relatively. Okay, and I love the fact that they're all different. And obviously I've talked about the communities that you get there as well. But what really interests me as well is that these islands also present potential for hazards that we've never experienced. And I mentioned earlier on that I was kind of brought into this world by Dr. Simon Day, and he studies landslides. Ocean island volcanoes can catastrophically landslide into the sea. Okay, and if you ever go to Tenerife, the northern part of Tenerife is missing. Okay, and if you look on, and there's this cool thing where you can actually look on the seafloor and actually study the seafloor. And what you'll see on the seafloor is this big lobe, and that big lobe represents material that has collapsed from the surface down onto the seafloor. All of the ocean island volcanoes have the potential not only to be volcanoes, because they are, but to be massive landslides. Okay, and so if you look at the island of La Palma looks like a kind of circular top and a teardrop at the bottom. And out the top of that circular bit at the top is a big scar that kind of goes down from, like, I'd say the center down to about 8 o'clock. And that big scar is a previous huge catastrophic landslide. And so, again, going back to what I said at the start about what interests me, low frequency, high magnitude events, these islands have that great potential. And I feel like there's a need to kind of assess that as well as the day-to-day risks that we get.
Wonderful, thank you. And you touched a little bit on having to make decisions from a kind of political point of view, but we've got the added challenges of climate change, we have shifted political landscapes. So what do you see as the most pressing needs for small developing island nations facing these multiple hazards?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the answer to my question, just go, next time there's a COP meeting, Conference of Parties meeting for climate change, if you can, watch the opening statements made by the states. And what you'll often get is you'll get the big people that are kind of hosting. I mean, we had it COP26 here a couple of years ago. It's been recently in COP28 in the United Arab Emirates. You have the hosting states, but you often have individual states that come in and give a talk. And one of the key things that they always say is that they're on the front line. They're the first people that kind of experience the impacts of climate change. And the big issue for them is 2 things. Number one is managing that problem, okay, because they are not equipped with the same financial and technological background necessarily as some of the more advanced states. And secondly, the issue is that they often didn't create that problem. They're often not the ones who are responsible, but they are the ones who are kind of dealing with it. And I feel that if you feel about how the impacts of these events, the impacts of climate change are hazards. Okay, that's climate change in itself is not a hazard. Okay, it is a phenomenon. Okay, but the impact of that climate change will cause sea level rise, will cause increased storm frequency, will cause increased rates of erosion, will cause increased flooding, not just from the sea coming in, but up through the floor of these islands. Many of these islands are made of coral or kind of sedimentary materials, or perhaps even volcanic materials. And in some cases, where they're made of sedimentary materials or past sediments, the water can come up through the floor and physically flood these places. Now, with that comes other hazards, secondary hazards like disease in water. Cholera can come from that. They can have an increased rate of mosquitoes and like the vector-borne diseases. And so one of the things that we study on our course in Manchester is we look at not only the hazard, but we look at the implications for health. And we also look at the implications for like the political management. And so it's not one problem. It's a combined problem whereby we put everything together. And I feel that these countries, they are the first to be overlooked, okay? And yet they're the first that are having to deal with it. And I feel that as a developed nation, it's our responsibility really to support these countries, not just with false promises, but actually with action that can enable them to make the right decision.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. That kind of concept of being kind of a global society and people being responsible for each other is massive, and the message is coming through in different ways, which is great. So finally, for the listeners that want to find out a little bit more of this area of geography, where would you advise them to go?
God, do you know what? I looked at this. I thought about this, and this is the hardest question of all. Okay, because there are so many different things that you can look at. There's so many great podcasts out there. I mean, obviously this one is one of them. But if you want to learn about disaster management, there's a disasters podcast that is run, and it covers a whole range of subjects. But the greatest place to start, really, for me, it's about the stories that you get from these. And as a student, you're probably learning these case studies at school, and you probably think to yourself, these are isolated events. But to learn more about the events, read the newspapers, read the internet about what is currently happening, stay on top of like these events that are happening, take a note of why it's impacted a particular place or how that place is responding. Because the News 24 that we have, in many respects, it's great that it follows the event and you can follow these things. And it's also terrible that 2 weeks later it forgets it. Okay. And so for me, that the news is a great source and a terrible source. If you want more kind of detailed information, for example, on climate change, the IPCC is a great starting place. And they've written these reports called the AR reports. And the most recent one is the AR6 report. And the AR6 report, there are 3 of them. Okay, and each of them, they write it for scientists, they write it for policymakers, i.e. people who don't have a technical understanding, and they write another one as well, but that's for neither of those groups. But the one that you want to read is a summary for policymakers. And what I love about the AR6 report, it's got a lot of graphics in there. And these graphics are really great ways of kind of showing like the problems, and you can learn a lot. And they're created from hundreds of scientists. And so when people say to you, "Is climate change a real thing?" the IPCC is not just 1 or 2 scientists saying, "Yeah, this is a problem." The IPCC is like everyone coming together, adding all of their little contributions together. And what they do is they come up with the probability of things happening. Okay, the reality is climate change is definitely happening, but the probability of it happening is a really important thing to consider. Okay, so how likely? And what the IPCC do is they say this is incredibly likely, this is quite likely, this might happen. And I think that gives you a kind of perspective on reality in terms of like the change that's going to happen. So in terms of climate change, IPCC, definitely. And they've got this really cool interactive atlas. So if you go on, type in IPCC interactive atlas, and you don't need to be a genius in terms of mapping, but you can actually like program the atlas from simple drop-down menus to show you how things are going to change in the future, looking at things like potential for climate change, the potential for rainfall, the potential for sea level rise. And it's great. And you can focus in on a particular area, and it creates all these graphs for you. And it's designed, I use it with every student, whether they've got a background in science or not. I think it's really amazing. In terms of science, in terms of the UK and hazards, because that's what we've been talking about, really great kind of things to kind of focus on. British Geological Survey has some really cool mapping kind of tools that you can use, and actually it shows you. I'm very much a visual person. I like to see things. I like to understand. I like to kind of, it's like when I go to communities, I like to go to people and go, "Where's your house? Show me where your house is." And they pick it out and they're like, "Oh, okay." And then I show them the map and they're like, "Oh, wow, I'm not in that area, or I am in that area." And that visualization makes a huge difference for them. So mapping tools done by the BGS, I mean, they've got a whole range of things. They've got the flood map. They've got earthquake seismicity that you can kind of bring in. We don't have any volcanic hazards here. Our main volcanics are from Iceland, believe it or not. In actual fact, volcanic hazards in the UK are quite high risk, mainly because of Iceland. not because we have any. Although we do have volcanoes in the UK. In fact, all of the west of the UK is volcanoes. The Lake District, Wales, Cornwall, Scotland. It's all old volcanoes. And the cool thing is that if we could live for 25 million years, we might yet see some more, but we're simply not going to be around that long. So there's that. The other thing I would recommend is the Environment Agency. It has some really amazing stuff on flooding as well, if you're interested in kind of local hazards. And you can actually type in your own postcode and it will give you the kind of levels of flood risk that you can. And if you're ever moving house, I strongly recommend that you look at that. On a more global scale, the USGS is a really great source for kind of international volcanoes or earthquake activity. So it depends. But ultimately, what I would say is that if you're really interested in these things, go to the places that have them. Okay, don't be frightened to visit and kind of look up areas. They're all relatively safe. You can go and do little tours. Local people will take you there and listen to the stories of local people who actually can tell you about what it's like to live in that space. For me, that's the greatest source. Whether that's in the UK and you're listening to people that live, for example, in Hebden Bridge that have been flooded in Yorkshire, or you go and talk to people that live on Stromboli and actually kind of manage and deal with the continual eruptions. So it is a wonderful opportunity. And I think that kind of balance between human and physical environment is such a valuable resource.
Wonderful. Thank you. Martin, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. It's been fascinating to delve into the specific areas of geography, and your thoughts will be incredibly enlightening. Yes, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's always nice to talk about things that you like talking about, and talking is something I can do all the time without any trouble. So yeah, I would say that if you are interested, I mean, obviously check us out on the Manchester website in terms of HCRI. You can always catch up with my email there. If you're really interested, you can actually get hold of me and ask me some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe to the Ask the Geographer podcast series on soundcloud.com or your preferred streaming platform. Dive deeper into the world of geography and stay informed with our wide range of resources, many of which are available for free. School membership grants access to even more resources, including online lectures and supporting materials for both teachers and learners. Explore our resources and discover our additional offers for education at www.rgs.org/schools.